Now that we're across the organisation and leadership of La Grande Armée, we can delve into the composition of its three major combat arms: the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery. And there's no better place to begin than in the thick of things with the infantry. There existed many different categories of infantry within La Grande Armée, all of which warrant a primer. We'll start by looking at the fusiliers and the grenadiers found in line regiments. Fusiliers were the bog-standard mainstay infantry. Their most important objective was to form the main line of battle upon which the other combat arms could hinge. The basic tactical requirement demanded a flexible type of soldier, one who could advance, withdraw, attack or defend as the situation required. Drilled in the full range of manoeuvres, fusiliers could adopt specific formations like anti-cavalry squares, flying columns or firing ranks. In other words, the fusiliers were generalists, able to do a bit of everything. Grenadiers, or grenadiers, likewise were able to maintain the line of battle, but were also called upon to serve as on-call assault troops. When a position had to be seized or a vanguard sent into a breach, grenadier companies were usually stripped from their parent battalions and formed into a provisional grenadier battalion, or possibly a division-sized grenadier reserve. Ad hoc grenadier units of all sizes played substantial roles in all of Napoleon's campaigns, as they were often placed under the care of some of his most aggressive commanders. Despite their name, grenadiers didn't use grenades at all and were equipped identically to the fusiliers. What distinguished them were bespoke uniforms, completed by a tall bearskin shako. Another quirk of the grenadiers was their unusual height. To become a grenadier, a fusilier had to have at least 2 years of exemplary service and be over 5 foot 6 inches tall. Better pay and privileges were also conferred on the grenadier, who knew that if he kept his chin up, he was well on his way to admission into the Imperial Guard. At Napoleon's behest, the Ministry of War began to organise regiments by region. Rural or urban areas originated most of the line regiments of grenadiers and fusiliers, while mountainous or forested departments provided the light regiments. Recruits over 5 foot 1 inches in height went to the line regiments, while those under this limit went to the light infantry. Outside of combat, light infantry hunted, scouted, foraged, and acted as sentries. In combat, all light infantry were skirmishers who provided screening and reconnaissance for the main line of battle. These duties necessitated light infantry assume a loose formation, with several paces between individuals. Initiative and adaptability were prized over outright courage, as in the line infantry. Successful light infantry had to be able to play fast and loose with malleable tactics and formations. The principal light infantry unit was the chasseur. Meaning hunter in French, the name might imply that these troops were like marksmen, meant to pick out enemy officers. Sharpshooting like this would have been tough, as chasseurs were equipped with the same musket as the fusiliers. Rather, their purpose was to harass the enemy in battle with a constant hail of fire. Any attempt to retaliate against the chasseurs would see them withdraw in a wake of gunsmoke into a protected position, ideally behind trees or bumpy terrain. A more specialist type of light infantry were called vertigeurs, vaulters or leapers in French. They were integrated into line regiments as in-house light infantry. They served identically to the chasseurs, save for one key difference. Vertigeurs were issued rifled carbines. In skilled hands, they were deadly out to a few hundred paces. As such, vertigeurs fulfilled a niche as marksmen, able to spot and shoot point targets like officers and musicians at longer ranges. Skirmishing with an enemy line invariably brought out enemy skirmishers and light cavalry in contest. If charged or caught out in the open, chasseurs and vertigeurs didn't stand a chance as they couldn't form the dense defensive formations of their fusilier comrades. The best protection was mobility and good cover. Failing that, if enemy skirmishers pressed too close or cavalry loomed, the carabiniers à pied were called upon. The carabiniers à pied were a mix of chasseur and grenadier. Their job was to protect friendly skirmishers or close with and kill those of the enemy. Carabiniers were recruited from the same crop of veterans as prospective regular grenadiers, wore the same distinct bearskin shako, and were often detached for special missions. The only real difference from regular grenadiers is that they fought dispersed as skirmishers rather than in rigid formations. Where chasseurs, carabiniers, and vertigeurs tended to fight alongside each other in the same battalions, tirailleurs operated in separate units. The word doesn't have a direct translation into English, but ranger or scout fits well enough. Most tirailleurs companies began as volunteer units formed in France's outlying departments or occupied regions. Recruits were drawn from locals who knew the terrain intimately. Those raised in Naples, Catalonia, Piedmont, or Corsica often enough had themselves once been anti-French partisans or bandits. As effective irregular fighters, tirailleurs served in the rear lines. They protected coastlines, harassed enemy incursions, and suppressed partisans. Some regularized tirailleur battalion did fight in major engagements throughout the Napoleonic Wars, performing analogously to the voltigeurs. Another whole class of French infantry plied their trade not with bayonets but with clarinets. They were les musiciens, musicians and instrumentalists, who formed a musical corps within la Grande Armée. Each French regiment had a musique, a band, led by a tambour major, the drum major. He was aided by a sous-major as 2IC. Each company of the regiment was assigned 2 drummers called tambouristes. From among the drummers, one would be promoted to the post of tambour maître, drum master. Drummers were trained in a variety of signals that dictated the tempo of regimental life. La diane or la rigadon served to rouse the troops awake. La corvée called an inspection, and à la paille, or to the bed, ended the day. La générale meant fall in or move out, often accompanied by a chorus of grumbling. In battle, the drummers were analogous to modern-day radio operators. In the pre-modern era, sound was the only way to get simple bits of information out quickly at distance. For a company, battalion or regiment operating on a small frontage, the call and response of the drums dictated what formation to take and the pace of the maneuvers made when changing formation. Orders were also relayed from the rear to the front by drum signals. Every advance was led by the tambour major and a gaggle of drummers who fell back when the order was given to convert from a column to line. When withdrawing, the drummers would signal where the regiment was to rally, allowing units to reform in the dark or even during a rout. For such a pivotal role, the French made surprisingly little use of trained musicians. They wouldn't pass on an experienced player naturally, but in general the policy was to train a new drummer out of a private plucked from the line. They were in for a world of pain. Simply lugging their instruments was a surprisingly physical ordeal, as the drummer hoisted their sturdy drum alongside a carbine. He was expected to march, sprint and climb whilst keeping a consistent beat, a tall order even for the heartiest recruit. No time was spared before the drummer was trained by the tambour maître in a very specific set of cadences, the meaning of signal orders, as well as the battery of orders to be performed each day. Mistakes, when they were made, were punished until drumming was as instinctive as marching. It was reckoned this process took about 5 years, or in the case of a truly exceptional drummer, 10. Few drummers went that long unscathed, being as they were so often at the spear tip and priority targets for enemy skirmishes. In the waning years of the Empire, raw recruits were trained by their forebears and put into action. Even les enfants de troupe, regimental youths, took up the sticks. That said, there were definite upsides to being in la musique. From the drummers to the major, all were released from the regiment's uniform code, leading to particularly opulent outfits. Styles varied from simply adding more lace and adornment to a regimental uniform, adopting fashion from the cavalry, all the way to invoking Egyptian, Persian and Turkish styles. Official complaints from the Imperial Guard at the supposedly unmartial airs of such styles slid across the desks of clerks at the War Ministry. Until 1812, such complaints were chalked up quite rightly to jealousy, and thus the bands were free to mix and match styles. Eventually, Napoleon weighed in, and as part of a larger effort at conformity, imposed a simpler dark green uniform on all bandsmen. Lost was the panache, even if the bandsmen still looked quite smart. A big problem often encountered by the drummers was the difficulty in making themselves heard over the cacophony of battle. Bunching the drummers together helped, but one stray cannonball or peal of musket fire could lay waste to the band. Line regiments took inspiration from their comrades in light regiments, who used cornets instead of drums. Cornets are little handheld trumpets that are much easier to carry than a full drum. Trompeteurs, or trumpeters, perform the light regiment's signals in the same way as the tambouriste of the line. Experiments ensued, all failures. Though the shrill tone of the cornet pierced the air like lightning, it couldn't produce the range of sounds needed for a line regiment's complex signals. Bugles, clairons in French, proved better fits but no match for the drums. The happy byproduct of this experimentation was the introduction of wind and brass instruments into la musique. Though they weren't fit for battlefield use, most regiments did adopt cornets and bugles as well as fifes for use during marches. The fife was particularly popular as it could play a pure tone, and so was perfect for holding a tune during marching songs. The French had no shortage of proud and irreverent marching songs which the troops belted out as they marched. The simplest would be bawdy tavern songs and shanties, or ditties recalling hearth and home. Classics like Ça ira, La Carmagnole, Vaillant au salut de l'Empire, and La Chant de Depart were popular with veterans of the Revolutionary era. Each found a new life in the voices of France's next generation, alongside some originals. La Marche du Premier Consul echoed from the 1800 Italian campaign well into the heyday of the empire. By far the most popular song was La Marseillaise, a revolutionary anthem reluctantly adopted by Napoleon as the official imperial anthem. Official fife and drum marches like La Victoire est à nous, Le Drapeau d'Austerlitz, Malbrook, Le Pas redoublé, and Le Pas de Charge were often accompanied by lyrics concocted by bored troops. Indeed, this habit of adding lyrics to marching beats or martial refrains produced most of the songs of this era. This is how the famous refrain Le Chanson de l'Oignon, literally the Song of the Onion, was popularized by the consular and later imperial Garde, from where it spread to the rest of the army. Returning the favour, the rank and file took the tune of La Rouge Chiffonnerie, but added their own lyrics to make On va lui percer le flanc. Literally, we're gonna pierce his sides, or to invoke the spirit in which it was meant, we'll stab him in the arse. Alongside the unofficial list of martial songs was an official list of approved marches to be played for ceremonial or celebratory occasions. This higher order of music necessitated a dedicated, non-combat band be on call for each regiment. There was no room for amateurism or improvisation in la musique haute, as compared to the music of fife and drum. A classically trained bandmaster, a chef de musique, handpicked an 8-man band. Soldiers in the regimental musique were preferred as they could be cross-trained, followed by the enfants des troupes. Civilians were drafted in when no musicians could be found in the regiment. Civilian draftees were called gagistes and were especially common on parades as a colonel would fork out funds to beef up the band to several dozen members for a deeper sound. That need to have a deep wall of sound meant a colonel was not picky about where his gagiste came from. Some were poached from other regiments, others taken as prisoners and deserters from foreign armies, or down on their luck musicians who tagged along with the army. Many brought their own instruments, adding a unique regional flair to each regimental band. Traditional French instruments like oboes, trombones, the horn and the flute were joined by Breton bagpipes, Basque tambourines, German bassoons and Italian violins. Be he a fusilier of the line, a skirmisher on sentry, or drummer beating reveille, the process by which a French citizen became a soldier always began the same way at the departmental level. The Empire maintained Jean-Baptiste Jourdain's conscription laws of 1798. Each department conducted their own census for unmarried and physically able men aged 20 to 25. This crop of potential recruits was called a classe. As envisaged, Jourdain's program could furnish France with up to 250,000 conscripts per year. However, the program failed to live up to immediate expectation, yielding pitiful returns. Worse still, conscripts were often unfit or unwilling to serve. In 1799, for instance, a class of 33,000 was demanded, but not even 10,000 conscripts were returned. This underperformance was the result of two factors. The first was bog-standard corruption. The second, and more important factor, was that the departments had leeway to provide only the amount of recruits that they felt that they could manage, a number which was always far below expectations. Widespread administrative reforms under the consulate from 1800 to 1804, which formed the framework of the coming empire, curtailed local graft and corruption. Furthermore, a quota system was placed on the yearly class after 1805. Essentially, each department was required to furnish a set number of conscripts and recruits for a year, with that number determined by military necessity. With 50 to 60,000 young men coming of fighting age each year, the class system was both flexible and stable. What gradually stretched the system to its breaking point was the year-on-year increase in the manpower demands imposed by Napoleon to expand and then defend his empire. Theoretically, if a yearly class was underutilised, it would create a surplus for the next year. But by that same token, overconscripting for a year would create a deficit, and Napoleon almost always demanded more than could be reasonably provided, kicking the manpower deficit down the road until the debt could not be paid. Most of the Napoleonic reforms to conscription occurred during the Peace of Amiens. Napoleon accepted 60,000 conscripts in 1802, and in an early sign of things to come, many were borrowed against 1803. This pattern chugged along for the next few years. A levy of 60 to 80,000 conscripts borrowed against the next year, with around a quarter to a third of this number seconded to the reserve in France. The years 1805 and 1806 were the first in which Napoleon could nominate the quota himself, and yielded particularly bumper crops, especially with the victories of Austerlitz and Jena Auerstedt triggering a surge of volunteerism. By 1807, however, conscription was facing widespread resistance. Not only were the manpower demands of Grande Armée rapidly scaling, but the French population had grown tired of sending their sons, brothers and husbands to war. Desertion was rife. Young men took to the hills at the first inkling of a recruiting party. Conscripts fled their training fields given half a chance. Even active duty frontline troopers quietly slipped the centuries, or in the extreme, self-mutilated. By law, priests, bureaucrats, students, and those in essential services were automatically exempted from service. For the average citizen, the only ticket out of service was to seek a replacement. If you could convince a veteran to re-enlist, they could go in your place. Alternatively, a lump 900 franc sum brought an exemption after a single year of service. But this led to further hostility to conscription as the burden of service fell on the shoulders of the poor masses of French peasants and labourers, especially as the cost of replacement ballooned to several thousand francs later in the wars. Local authorities, especially in the south of France and Piedmont, protected local families that refused to offer their sons. By 1811, there were an estimated 31,000 deserters loose in France, and the main army suffered desertions of thousands more each year. This trend was only curbed by increased patrols of the gendarmerie, bounties for apprehended draft dodgers, or the surgical use of martial law. A favoured tactic was to billet soldiers with a family or village known to be protecting fugitives. To spare their families and neighbours the burden, deserters and draft dodgers willingly chose to return to the colours. Such was the desperation for manpower that a malefactor was generally treated leniently. First-time offenders could pay a fine to be returned to full pay and status. More sustained delinquency saw a deserter placed into a refractory battalion on garrison duty. These units had a good track record of reforming their soldiers, most of whom returned to regular service at risk of foregoing their pension. Truly unreformable soldiers faced possible execution, though a vast majority were sent on a colonial assignment instead, from which most had never returned. The Battle of Eylau in February 1807 saw La Grande Armée suffer a ghastly 25,000 casualties, its worst single-day butcher's bill to that date. Replacements were called in from the reserve, which in turn had to be refilled. Therefore, in March, Napoleon ordered the class for 1808 to be called a year early. He did the same in 1809 to meet the renewed threat from Austria. What's more, the class of previous years were ordered to transfer their quotas of conscripts currently in reserve duty to frontline service. The French training and supply pipeline was adequate for training and equipping the average of around 80,000 recruits a year. But to suddenly make soldiers out of about 250,000 was an impossible order without attendant drops in discipline, morale, and combat effectiveness. Unsurprisingly then, La Grande Armée began to suffer on the field. Performance in the War of the Fifth Coalition was subpar, and France suffered its first total defeat when an entire field army was annihilated by the Spanish at Baylen. That said, we shouldn't overstate the drop in French army quality after 1807. Morale was high and a regiment still drilled to exacting standards. This was a decline, not a collapse, that speaks just as much to the definitive improvement in the combat abilities of coalition armies that coincided with a loss in performance for La Grande Armée. There could be no doubt, however, that the glory days of 1805 and 1806 were in the rearview mirror. The closest return to form for La Grande Armée came in 1811 with the build-up for the Russian campaign. Napoleon called for the largest class to date, 120,000, with a little less than 8,000 seconded to the reserve. In 1812, Napoleon again made an unprecedented move, relaxing service requirements and calling 2 concurrent class of 245,000 conscripts. The first batch of 165,000 was to reinforce La Grande Armée, the second of 80,000 to reinforce the National Guard. This was a solid chunk of the force of over 600,000 that marched into Russia in the summer of 1812. Only around half of French regiments, the rest a combination of reinforcements from French client states and allies. Despite the immensity of these preparations, and the distinction of forming the largest army ever before assembled in Europe before the latter half of the 19th century, Napoleon's ambitions were dashed in Russia. Only a shattered remnant of the once proud Grande Armée escaped the Eastern debacle. The consequent military emergency of 1813 prompted the army to scrounge reinforcements from the depot battalions, training grounds, and the navy. Even the National Guard and Gendarmerie weren't spared. Almost reflexively, another huge class was borrowed against 1814. The total effect of this mighty effort was the reformation of La Grande Armée to a nominal strength of 300,000. The army was far from its calibre of 1805, but it was still a very capable force which Napoleon led to a series of increasingly unlikely victories. Despite these efforts, the Battle of Leipzig proved to be the tipping point and precipitated a general collapse of the French front in central Germany. In the pell-mell retreat west to the Rhine, German units abandoned La Grande Armée if they hadn't defected or deserted already. Italian, Swiss, and Dutch regiments disintegrated. In desperation, Napoleon called for the class of 1814, expecting 300,000 conscripts. He received a mere 50,000. The French recruitment system was running on fumes, the policy of borrowing troops today against the future belatedly draining the tank dry. The collapse of the empire upon Napoleon's abdication in April 1814 proved only temporary respite for the beleaguered families of France. The emperor gave an encore in his infamous 100 Days campaign. After a chunk of the French army defected to him, he called upon all those veteran officers and soldiers who would serve. A reforged Grande Armée numbered 122,000 troops, and though heavily outnumbered, claimed some outstanding initial successes against the coalition. It meant little in the end. Victory went to the coalition at Waterloo, wherein La Grande Armée was smashed between an Anglo-Dutch anvil and a Prussian hammer. Throughout the entirety of the Napoleonic period, France levied over 2.6 million conscripts, though only around 1.35 million would ever serve, roughly divided evenly between reserve duty and frontline duty. For most of these conscripts, their time in La Grande Armée began in the nearest town. A recruiting party of gendarmes, led by an army officer, would make it known that they were calling for conscript to meet the year's class. The Ministry of War Administration would apportion a quota of the class to each department, and then the department to their constituent communes. The mayor of the commune would then take the commune's census, which consisted of all able-bodied men aged 18 to 40. Of this group, men aged 18 to 25 would be enrolled into a lottery. After 1812, this range was upped to between 18 and 30 years of age. Those in attendance drew numbers from a ballot, absentees had their numbers drawn too. In general, those holding the lowest half of the numbers were conscripted into the active duty army. Higher numbers were either exempted or given to the reserves. We'll follow a conscript for the active army. Presuming the conscript was physically able, didn't have a dependent family, and had no legitimate reason for an exemption, they were escorted to the nearest army depot. Here they were given the rudiments of army life: a uniform, a knapsack, and a bedroll. Basic physical training began immediately, even before the conscript was assigned to a unit. Ultimately, a conscript would end up in one of three places: the trained reserves of an existing regiment, temporary units whose troops would be dispersed where needed at the end of training, or a newly established unit. No matter where they were fated to go, the conscript underwent infantry training. The basic program saw a conscript take to marching, carry and maintain their equipment, fire and load a rifle, learn signals, practice formations, and follow orders. Discipline was strict, with any infringements likely to see a recruit docked pay or pull extra duties. Corporal punishment was forbidden, the only army in Europe to do so at the time. All recruits were buddied up. They slept two to a bed so that one could perform their duties while the other slept. This buddy system was especially helpful for conscripts who fell behind, were sick, or otherwise indisposed, as their comrades would helpfully take up the slack. Gradually, as competency increased, a conscript was given responsibilities like guard duty, leading work parties, or tutoring the incoming greenhorns. Everyone started as a lowly soldat, a private in modern military grading. The best of the conscripts might be made caporal or corporal, with some making caporal fourrier, who was placed in charge of daily inspections. Whatever their rank, the infantry all went by the same moniker, fantassins, at once a term of derision and a badge of honour. Les fantassins took comforts where they could. Life in the infantry was hard. Marching all day over rough terrain in mercurial weather, sleeping cheek by jowl in crowded cantonments, or under open sky, risking life and limb in battle, and all done with a rumbling stomach, Swiss cheese boots, and a threadbare uniform. Even when not on campaign, a soldier could expect to be drilling, parading, or otherwise engaged in routine labour. It's no wonder then that Napoleon insisted that the only true mark of a good soldier was not bravery, skill, or intelligence. It was forbearance against hardship. By far the most strenuous activity which the infantry engaged in was marching, dreaded far more than battle. Moving a battalion, a regiment, a division, and then a corps from point A to point B demanded massive amounts of men and material be shifted in a very short time over immense distances. Weather, terrain, and resistance be damned. No soldier remained long without becoming an experienced marcher, and as it turned out, the French proved to be the best. The Austrians and Russians were capable of surprising bursts of speed, the Prussians were organised but slow, the British packed heavy and marched about as fast. No other army of the time consistently averaged marches as long, as fast, or as far as the French. As we've seen, marching orders were issued to the corps commanders. They executed the orders by sending mounted scouts out to fan out ahead of the advance. They'd scout out the terrain, find detours if needed, and then report back. Following not far behind would be an advanced guard escorted by light cavalry. This guard was sent ahead to make any arrangements for officer building, if possible, and to establish a proper rallying point as far ahead as the orders required. Engineers might also go ahead with the advance guard to reinforce roads and erect pontoons. In the meantime, detailed marching orders percolated down to each regiment. Their constituent battalions were given precise times by which they had to depart, and in what order. Rarely was there any time to lose, so marches generally began at dawn. After breakfast, the battalion set off in columns one after the other, leaving behind all that wasn't strictly necessary. On roads within France or Allied nations, the battalions marched in double file lines at the side of the road, leaving the middle of the road free for traffic. When in hostile country, the entire road was used. As needed, the battalions could also march across country. In all cases, the battalion in the lead dictated the pace for the entire regiment. Standard marching speed was exactly 67 steps to the minute. This cadence was carefully maintained by drummers marching at the front of the column. It was vital that the leading battalion stick as close to the set pace as possible. Failing to do so would cause massive slowdowns in the battalions as each bunched up against the other. If you want an example of this phenomenon in action, think about highway or freeway driving. A slowdown ahead causes a slowdown behind, which then ripples back through traffic. This phenomenon was well understood in the Grande Armée, and the main solution was to stagger the battalions by an interval of 240 feet. That way, the pace could be modified if the forward battalion slowed or sped up without causing jams. The average march covered between 15 to 20 kilometers a day. Each hour there was a small break. In my country, we'd call it a smoko, and the French probably wouldn't shirk the comparison, as the halte de pipe or halte de fumée was just enough time for a smoke or a drink. A longer lunch break was called for at midday. This pause gave time for the troops to drop their gear and eat. Eventually the march would resume and carry on until a stop was called. Marching at night saw torches and candles lit to guide the way. In full kit and over rough terrain, each march was a test in endurance, but nothing compared to the dreaded forced marches. Napoleon was not averse to calling for a forced march of 30 to 35 miles per day. A forced march can sometimes erroneously be reduced to a demand that the troops advance with all due haste, but in reality it referred to a specific type of marching. The morning breakfast would be observed, but after that the pace was set at 100 steps per minute, sometimes more. Halts would be ignored, and the march continued for as long as was ordered. In effect, it was a marathon set at jogging pace that continued from dawn till dusk, and sometimes even longer. Grueling 24-hour forced marches were the norm. Davout's Third Corps even completed a 36-hour march from Vienna to Austerlitz to relieve Claude Legrand at Telnitz. Earlier in the campaign, in another epic feat of endurance, the Imperial Guard covered the distance from Paris to the front in Germany in only a few days. A normal march was brutal enough, but a forced march was something else entirely. Men would fall out of line, dazed and exhausted. Heatstroke and dehydration felled many more, especially in hotter climates. Some might collapse and die, succumbing to exhaustion. Those who didn't have the strength to continue were loaded onto wagons or carried on a litter, but under no circumstances could the columns stop. As a result, forced marches carried a steep price. Not only did the strain kill several soldiers per regiment, but it undermined cohesion and discipline. Many of the forced marches that seemed to miraculously deliver a corps in the nick of time more accurately delivered only a rump of the fittest troops. 2/3 or more of a corps could be strung out in a long line stretching back many miles. Knowing this, corps commanders would call their own forced marches only in dire situations. Napoleon was less cautious, arguably too quick to order a forced march. Nonetheless, forced marches were an important tool in his belt, allowing him to amass forces within a day when several might be needed elsewise. It fell to the officers to keep cohesion during forced and regular marches. An uphill struggle, often literally, given the tough terrain on which the Grande Armée tread. Even the most organised of marches saw soldiers drop out of line, wagons get bogged down, and pack animals collapse. The best the officers could do was maintain discipline, which they did with an iron fist. The aim was to keep the columns advancing in good order at all times. Here the officer's sabre saw its real use, smacking the heads of malingering or dawdling fantassins. Such unerring discipline was imposed for practical reasons. Disorder was intolerable in campaigns in which any delay could imperil carefully laid plans. Of course, little could be done to mitigate the vagaries of weather and terrain, which were ultimately the true arbiter of progress. After all, there's no fast way for an army to pass a bog or highlands or rivers. Morale was also closely tied to the order of a march, and after repeated defeats after 1813, La Grande Armée marched in lazy heaps rather than rigid columns. Still, in totality, French soldiers were formidable marchers. La Grande Armée's great achievement was to marry blistering speed with machine-like consistency. Napoleon might have demanded a great deal of his soldiers on the march, but he did not fail to recognise the achievement. In many of his addresses, he noted the supreme effort it had taken to march such long distances. The fact that Napoleon could rely on his corps' marching consistent stints is an unsung secret to his success. At the end of a long march, the troops would take up their encampments. How the army encamped depended entirely on where they were. Billeting was the norm within France and in allied nations. As mentioned, scouting parties would make arrangements for a town and its villages to temporarily host a few regiments. A quick-thinking mayor might preempt the woe that had befallen his town by trying to bribe the regimental officers with plum accommodations or local delicacies. Anything to keep the army marching to the next town over. It's no wonder the inhabitants would do just about anything to avoid playing host to a rowdy regiment. Soldiers traipsing through their homes and surrounds wouldn't take long to sniff out any food or valuables not hidden away. Missing chickens, barrels of wine, and tableware might be counted as blessings against the alternative of outright looting, but it did nothing to endear the troops to their hosts. Large cities or those with garrisons might have suitable buildings like barracks, warehouses, or convents fit for large numbers of troops. In these instances, their presence was tolerated as it was a prime chance to make some quick cash. Cobblers and merchants plied a brisk trade, as did washerwomen and prostitutes. Cities on the well-trodden routes connecting Paris to the front lines built a portion of their local economies on exploiting their thoroughfare status. Bribery and extortion were also well-honed arts. A certificate of good conduct was used to certify the corps commander that a regiment had acted within the law whilst posted within a town or city. Unless the colonel of a regiment was willing to cough up some cash or offer preferential terms, the mayor might withhold their approval. Most times the army was merely there on layover. Extended stays were where the real problems started, as soldiers would tend to pick up odd jobs that would put pressure on the resident labourers and farmers. They also invariably fraternised with the locals in taverns and brothels, fights and falling outs aplenty. Officers were generally well liked, if only because they paid for their meals and accommodations, but in the end everyone was happier and healthier when the army departed. Though the density of towns and villages in Western and Central Europe meant La Grande Armée could billet most nights, in southern Italy, Spain and Eastern Europe, the norm was to bivouac out in the open. In friendly territory, the regiment made camp as near as possible to any amenities like wells, taverns or villages. In hostile territory, security was more important than convenience, and so a prescribed process was followed. Corps would make camp in order of battle in areas that were as open as possible. The idea was that if needed, each regiment could gather at predetermined rallying points ready to repel any attack. Troops arrived at their bivouac after a long march to find yet more work ahead. Some were sent out to establish the perimeter, others to forage, and the rest set to work making the camp. Regiments could go about this properly or quite haphazardly. The best regiments certainly opted for order and arranged camps battalion by battalion, with a colonel ensconced in the centre surrounded by a gaggle of officers' tents. Soldiers slept in full kit around campfire bivouacs within the confines of the camp. Since most encampments were temporary affairs, there was no need to erect tents or proper structures. Napoleon even preferred tents never be erected at all, since it meant carrying extra baggage, made the camps conspicuous at distance, and encouraged the troops to hunker down. Nonetheless, semi-permanent camps did have to be established often enough, especially as the army assembled before a campaign. This gave the engineers time to give the place a glow-up, building latrines, marking roads, and digging emplacements for artillery upon high ground. Tents went up around campfires, and the officers had working parties build huts for their own use. When a camp became well established, such as those along the Channel coast, in Warsaw, in Madrid and elsewhere, they became well-regulated mini-cities. Soldiers banded together to make their own cabins and barracks, depots, smithies and stables provided services, while full parade grounds gave a chance to practice manoeuvres. Indeed, Napoleon was adamant that camps never be idle, as left to their own devices these soldiers would gamble and drink, and the officers skeeve off to the countryside to hunt. Orders went out for daily parades and inspections. It was also essential that any replacements be wetted and the officers constantly given regular duties to perform. La Grande Armée could march this way and that, but would never get far on an empty stomach. Food was one of the few areas of comparative improvement in the lives of the soldiers, officers and fantassins alike. A typical French diet was composed largely of bread, meat and veggies, along with the obligatory quota of wine. La Grande Armée took pains to improve the nutritional and caloric content of a soldier's diet over that of the average Frenchman by providing a diverse range of staple foods in larger quantities. Provisioning regulations finalised in 1806 established that each regiment would be provided funds from the Ministry of War Administration to the tune of 15 centimes per soldier per day. In times of peace, these funds would go towards purchasing meat and veggies, which were served as 2 hot meals a day from the company mess. Whilst on campaign, the mess provided only 1 meal of soupe de jour, usually boiled meat and vegetables, supplies permitting. This was prepared in large pots for communal food prep. For the rest of their nutritional needs, soldiers were issued with a standard set of rations. Bread was the basic ration, and given the French predilection for bread, came in a few varieties. Pain de munition, made from flour and rye, was baked into a pan, taking on a rounded, circular shape. Issued 1 per man when available, or divvied up between several when in short supply, these loaves were portable and filling. Sometimes a pain de munition was made entirely of wheat, or at least a finer wheat, to give a softer, more aerated texture. This pain blanc, or pain de soupe, as the name suggests, was eaten with a hot meal. Black bread or brown bread, beloved by France's German allies, never caught on, despite its hardy properties and longevity. Instead, for a long-life bread, the French baked bread in a smaller pan for longer to give a thick crust. Pain biscuit, as it was called, could last for weeks as the crust provided a hard seal against moisture. Properly stored, these were the rations stocked in forts meant to endure long sieges as well. All breads were baked by company cooks, usually millers or bakers in their civilian lives, and sent to the hungry troops. If this was impossible, either because of time constraints or shortages, flour would be issued in place of bread. The making of bread, in fact, informed the structure of French escouades, or squads, also called ordinaires. A squad of around 10 to 15 soldiers, led by a caporal, was formed around a single camp kettle, a marmite. Each company was issued 8 of these kettles, meaning 8 squads per company. Cooking duties might fall on the appointed squad chef, but everyone was expected to literally carry their load. Hatchets, pans, pots, hand-cranked mills, all were needed to cook or bake at camp. In low-intensity or rear-line areas, camp followers took on these duties, but not to the same degree as in other contemporary armies. Just like today, the French took their cuisine very seriously. Funnily enough, French soldiers were content to make mostly do with bread, but they would never shirk a ration of meat, veggies, fruits, or eggs. It was institutional knowledge that a diverse range of fatty and nutritional foods were essential to keep the troops fighting fit. Preserved rations had first been issued by the Revolutionary Army, but where possible the Grande Armée opted for fresh supplies, be they requisitioned, purchased, or at worst, pilfered. Ideally, this bounty was added to the daily soup, but in a pinch soldiers would get some meat and veggies for their own use. Meat, if not cooked and eaten, would be turned into a kind of jerky. Veggies might be thrown into a pot or eaten with bread. A vinegar ration even ensured that some astute soldiers could craft their own spreads and conserves, if they could find the right vessel, of course. Other foodstuffs found their way into the knapsacks of French soldiers depending on the region and time of year. Cheese, rice, and fruit were particularly appreciated. Famously, La Grande Armée was rapacious, given the operational necessity of marching light. Standing orders when in enemy territory were to forage and requisition all food and fodder. Living off the land might have been expedient, but it picked clean entire regions quickly. French soldiers were the masters at squeezing out every opportunity for scrounging. Fishing, hunting, and foraging expeditions were near constant, as were run-ins with locals. In the main, these interactions were fraught but peaceful. No one wanted to give up their food and drink to hungry soldiers, but if it's between that and letting them carry off a live animal, or worse yet, billet, the choice was the lesser of other evils. Outright looting did occur in French campaigns in Iberia and Eastern Europe, and as discipline eroded on the imperial collapse after 1813. Officers were under strict orders to punish all instances of looting, especially in friendly territory, though when and where they chose to observe these orders depended on the state of supply. Hungry troops were unruly troops, and all but the most principled officers would lean on the old adage, out of sight, out of mind. From frozen forests to balmy deserts, dehydration was always a soldier's worst enemy. Freshwater sources were scouted out and protected, used to refill hefty wooden barrels carted along by each regiment's supply company. Experienced soldiers never missed a chance to refill their canteens, not knowing when another chance would pop up. Before use in cooking or cleaning, water was boiled in the kettle so it was sterile, but it was not commonly drunk. Wine was the soldier's refreshment of choice. Red wines were preferred, but none would shirk whatever local vintages could be procured. French soldiers devised some peculiar ways to enjoy their wines. At the most basic level, they might be watered down. Others added salt, vinegar, or other alcohols to make a kind of brew. Veterans in the Imperial Garde took a pinch of gunpowder to their wine. Palatability aside, morale hinged on the wine supply. Indeed, if the French soldier was to choose between wine and bread, he'd opt for the wine. In Germany and Eastern Europe, where wine was nowhere near as common, beer was all that could be provided regularly. The French only imbibed it for lack of anything else. Another alcohol ration of brandy was provided separate to wine. Called colloquially eau de vie, water of life, you can guess how important the brandy ration was. Not only was it nice for a tipple, but brandy was a general-purpose antiseptic, cleaning agent, and morale booster. Charges were often preceded by a swig to harden hearts. Unlike with beer, local substitutes, vodka in Poland and Russia, schnapps in Germany, rum in the colonies, were gulped with glee. But as the wars endured, spirits were replaced by distilled wine, and even straight alcohol in vinegar or water. This quite literally didn't go down easily. In 1812, Napoleon tasted one such concoction and immediately ordered the inspectorate begin quality control. Marching and encamping were activities that occupied, let's say, 90% of a soldier's life under the colours, but it was all in service to that minority of time spent in combat, where the infantry had to rely upon their training, their comrades, and their equipment. The standard weapon of the infantry was the Chandler, a muzzle-loading 70 caliber flintlock musket named after the arsenal where it was incepted. This was the final version of the Chaleville produced in the arsenals of Saint-Etienne and elsewhere under the Kingdom of France. Fine-tuning and incremental improvements meant that it was an effective weapon, emphasizing durability and ease of use. That didn't mean that further improvements were off the table though. In 1800, Napoleon ordered the Ministry of War to revise their weapon procurement process. The Chaleville Modèle 1777, the Chaleville model of 1777, was revised to a Modèle 1800, the Model 1800. The 1800 was slightly less complex, used fewer materials, and incorporated a few field-expedient modifications. Accompanying this was the use of high-quality flints produced in France. The exact methods kept a state secret. At the time of this reorganization, France had hundreds of thousands of older rifles and captured weapons which were still usable, and they went to rearline units in the Army of the Interior, the Gendarmerie, or to Allied nations. Frontline units in the Grande Armée received the best weapons. New and old arsenals in Saint-Etienne, Versailles, Liège, Turin, Maubeuge, Tulle, and of course Chaleville, pumped out modern muskets. By 1804, La Grande Armée was equipped with several 100,000 muskets, carbines and pistols. In all, 2.5 million would be produced from 1800 to 1814. The base Chaleville weighed 10 pounds and was 1.57 metres long. This long barrel length, combined with the black powder charge, meant that on paper the Chaleville could shoot out to about a kilometre. Typical practice was only to fire within about 100 metres of a body of enemy troops. Skirmishers were adept target shooters, and under favourable conditions the best could bullseye something out to about 150 metres. The actual projectile fired by the musket was a small ball of lead, sometimes stone or another soft metal. The firing charge was provided by gunpowder, a formula of saltpeter, charcoal and sulphur. In French practice, the ball and gunpowder were wrapped in paper to make a cartridge, an early type of bullet. Though time-consuming, requiring shift work to complete, French troops liked having cartridges as opposed to loose musket balls, paper and gunpowder. Not only did it save time reloading, but it made for smoother, more consistent firing. Each of these cartridges was stored in a small box called a giberne, slung from the hip in battle. In addition to the 35 or so cartridges and spare flints, the giberne also contained all the various tools of weapon maintenance. The fantassin was trained to fire in a 5-step firing drill. He began by drawing a cartridge from his giberne, biting the paper from its bottom to expose the gunpowder charge, and then inserting it into the bassinet or priming pan of the musket. Next, taking a horn of gunpowder called a cartouche from his belt, he would pour some into the bassinet, then brace the butt of the musket against the ground and pour another pinch down the barrel. With the musket still braced, the musket ball was inserted down the barrel and pushed to the base by a ramrod. With this complete, the musket was ready to fire. Pulling the trigger would release the spring at the base of the flint, which would spark through the touch hole into the firing pan and ignite the charge therein. A fully trained soldier could fire between 2 and 3 rounds a minute, up to 4 or 5 if they cut corners. For instance, in the opening stages, the musket ball could be bitten off and later spat down the barrel. It was also possible to skip the opening firing steps by closing the bassinet, inserting the cartridge, and then smacking the musket against the ground, instead of using the ramrod. At the cost of a lower power shot, this could cut the loading times in half. The French did find, however, that a hearty bang on the butt could shear the thing off. For these sorts of reasons, soldiers of all armies were generally reluctant to skimp out on vital steps, only really doing so to repel charges. An improperly loaded musket was far more dangerous to the user than to the target. In the heat of battle, leaving a ramrod in the barrel, or accidentally double-loading 2 cartridges might see the musket detonate, blinding, maiming, or killing the user. Recruits were hyper-prone to these mishaps, but even veterans came to grief when, through no fault of their own, the mass-produced weapon misfired on average once every 10 shots. For battlefield use, the giberne contained a handy bullet extractor called a tire-balle. Having to use the tire-balle under fire was not fun, so preventive maintenance proved the best hope for limiting misfires, or worse still, catastrophic failures. A long needle was used to defoul the touch hole, and oil to grease the firing mechanism. Corporals carried spare springs and the device to remount them. A bad flint was often the cause of a misfire. New ones were stored in wax paper, while used ones, as the veterans were quick to impart to the newbies, could be somewhat restored by using the bayonet or ramrod as a whetstone. Barrels fouled quickly, needing a full cleaning out after 50 shots. This was accomplished by removing the barrel, submerging it in water, and then oiling it up with a rag. The process of cleaning and maintaining the weapon was in many ways more important than firing it. Good companies cleared and cleaned their rifles daily, an ounce of prevention and all that. Plugging barrels with cork tampillon, covering the firing pan with wax paper, or even purchasing or fashioning a leather holster, all prevented the musket from wear and tear. Such measures were especially useful in wet or snowy conditions, where the combination of damp powder or poor sparking could see misfires with almost every shot. Testy though it was, the Chalville, when fired in massed volleys by trained hands, was a brutally effective weapon. The better part of this effectiveness was training. The French drilled relentlessly to an exacting standard. Firing and loading were drilled to a point where they became muscle memory. Some things never became easy, only bearable. The recoil in the musket was a solid kick to the upper body. Bracing against the blow kept a soldier upright at the cost of bruising along the shoulder and arm. Repeated firing also enveloped him in thick, acrid smoke. Dehydration quickly set in, made worse by the inadvertent swallowing of some of the gunpowder with each reload. This is to say nothing of the deafening boom of hundreds, if not thousands of muskets, firing in the cacophony of battle. Eyes stinging, mouth parched, body battered and bruised. Even when done right, firing was a tough time. Mercifully, if we might say that, firefights were usually short and sharp. French tactics emphasized shock action. Equipped with a bayonet, each soldier was also drilled to thrust, parry and charge. Being as it was 1.57 meters in length, the Chalville was as tall as the minimum height of a French conscript, 5 foot 1 inch. Adding onto this a triangular bayonet of about 25 centimeters long, the infantry wielded a dangerous, if cumbersome, multi-purpose weapon. The bayonet had other advantages too. Often the metal was so soft that it could be bent with a bit of brute force, and there are reports of French troops using a curved bayonet like a hook to go fishing. Other close-range weapons found their way into the hands of the infantry. Technically, a curved short sword called a briquet, resembling a slightly smaller sabre, was meant to be standard issue, but shortages restricted its equipping only to certain units. After 1807, the briquet was officially restricted to junior officers, the Imperial Guard, and select skirmisher companies. Not that it stopped the fantassins from finding their own, of course, or otherwise sourcing pikes, daggers, shovels, and other pointy things for close encounters. This policy of restricting certain weapons to certain troops carried on throughout La Grande Armée. The Chalville came in 3 main varieties: the base fusil, given to line infantry and skirmishers, a short-barreled carbine called a mousqueton, and a version of the carbine called a fusil de dragons. The mousqueton was issued to the company musicians and the sappers, both groups needing their hands free, and as the name hints, the fusil de dragons was a cavalry carbine. Officers and sergeants were issued special carbines with their barrels rifled for enhanced accuracy and range. The rifling made the carbine tough to reload as the cartridge had to be forced down the barrel, but in skilled hands it could take the head right off a target up to 200 paces. For this reason it was popular with the skirmishers, particularly the voltigeurs. Firing prone, resting the barrel on their shako, voltigeurs did more than harass enemy troops. They could sight and shoot enemy officers and musicians with relative impunity. Personal non-regulation weapons were also found among La Grande Armée's officers. There were no prescriptions on using such weapons, and so many carried cavalry carbines and long-barreled pistols. Others purchased bespoke German, Italian and French firearms from artisanal workshops. None of these non-standard designs ever saw widespread adoption. French designers proffered breech-loading rifles, double-barreled pistols, hand-cranked carbines and other novel innovations. But they all shared the same essential problem: a neat idea that could not be feasibly mass-produced. Any man could wield a musket, but it was only by wearing a uniform he could claim to be a soldier. By the time La Grande Armée was formed, the provisioning of uniforms was directly overseen by the Ministry of War, replacing the reliance on an inefficient system of contractors which consistently hampered the Revolutionary Army. Contractors were still used, but they augmented state-run textile works, and all sources of uniforms were carefully vetted by the ministry. The various components of a uniform were produced to the specifications of a regiment or its colonel, with the orders placed at a company level. There existed a bewildering plethora of styles, designs, and tones on display in French uniforms. Famed for their extravagance are the flashy uniforms of the Hussar and Imperial Guard, who will get the spotlight in due course. But that doesn't mean that the regular infantry didn't boast their own fantastic designs. Each infantry regiment had its own tenue, or outfit, made of two parts. The petite tenue was essentially consistent between regiments. It consisted of a sleeved white waistcoat over which was worn a vest and suspenders. On the legs went white breeches worn over stockings. Gaiters were often worn too, either at full or half length. The Grande tenue was a battle dress and parade dress in one. The main part was a fitted coat made in the regimental style. No matter the style, fitted coats were always replete with a fine array of embroidery, buttoning, patterning, and lining. Sleeves, collars, and the coat lining were usually gold, green, or red. A bonnet, a simple field cap, was top cover for the petite tenue. In battle, the soldiers wore a chapeau, a conical hat made of felt and boiled leather. On its face went either an imperial or regimental emblem. To distinguish at a glance drab black or grey shako from one unit to another, many were adorned with a colourful set of feathers, ribbons, embroidery, or stitchwork. The more ornate the better. Worth noting too was the French practice of sewing rank insignia into the lower sleeves of their uniforms. Enlisted and non-commissioned ranks were denoted by a series of chevrons and stripes. Soldats, privates, wore no insignia. Caporal, corporals, wore two horizontal red stripes, and caporal fourrier, basically supply clerks, two red chevrons. Sergeant, sergeants, wore a single golden or white stripe, and a sergeant major, sergeant majors, two parallel golden chevrons. At 10 years of service, regardless of rank, an enlisted man was granted the honour of a single golden chevron worn above the sleeve on the shoulder. Uniform regulations for La Grande Armée were only set in February 1806, and even then only loosely. Infantry regiments almost exclusively use bleu impérial as their base colour, though many light regiments preferred green. The use of dark blue was a hangover from the Revolutionary Army that had dyed its stocks of white Royal Army coats with indigo. The British embargo made importing indigo tough, so there was serious consideration given to only a light daub of indigo, or ditching blue entirely and dyeing the coats grey. White made a perfunctory return in 1806 and 1807, though blue took back its rightful place when friendly fire incidents between French, Saxon, Prussian, and Austrian troops occurred. Embarrassingly too, La Grande Armée needed to relearn the Revolutionary Army's lessons on colour dyeing. They discovered the hard way that if you want a blue coat, it must be dyed very heavily in the first place. La Grande Armée never quite got this mix right. Some producers overdyed, others underdyed. Some mixed green and yellow when indigo was short. The result was that the infantry donned an oceanic panoply of blue hues. Dust and dirt would darken the tone given time, creating a somewhat consistent shade of dark blue. The chapeau, by comparison, was a clear success of the uniform regulations. These well-constructed hats were both popular and practical. Soldiers much preferred the chapeau, which, unlike the old revolutionary chapeau, was quite sturdy and could even be covered in fabric to protect against the elements. They also liked that up inside its conical frame was space for linen, a brush, and sewing kit. The basic design of the chapeau had its origins with the hussars of the Revolutionary Army, but the French infantry firmly cemented it as their own by adding a brim, a chin strap, and after 1810, a cloth flap on the back that could be used to protect the nape of the neck. Napoleon, to both economize and improve uniforms within La Grande Armée, paid close attention to any improvements that were proposed. Only by donning a pristine uniform and wearing it well could a soldier feel a sense of belonging and pride. In his mind, a uniform had to be smart and practical in equal measure. It came as a shock then that Napoleon received reports from the Ministry of War Administration's embedded inspectors that neither the soldiers nor the officers shared this opinion. The soldiers, of course, made their own field expedient modifications that led to distinct un-uniformity. For instance, the three-piece legwear of breeches, stockings, and leggings proved hard to march in and too hot in warm weather. Most soldiers discarded their leggings until they could find a comfy pair of pantalons, or trousers. Regimental officers didn't crack down on these infringements because it was they who made money by bulk ordering trousers for a company and then pocketing soldiers' pay in lieu. Besides, most regimental officers only cared about snazzy coats and shako, not humdrum daily wear. Regiments vied for the most elegant, ornate, and boisterous designs. Not only did this enhance the imagined prestige of the regiment, but it was an excellent source of cash. A complex uniform demanded a bunch of fabrics, adornments, and dyes which came from a company's uniform allowance. By upping the complexity, the regiment could demand more money from the Ministry of War administration. Napoleon was aware of these sorts of inefficiencies and abuses, but the issue could only be dealt with head-on after the defeat of Austria in 1809. New regulations issued in 1810 stamped out the worst officers' excesses and made official many of the field expediencies made by the soldiers, namely the woolen trousers. Uniform allowances were also curtailed, as were the abuses on poor fantassins, who until the changes were made to pay for their own spare uniforms and clothing out of pocket. Contractors back in France were augmented by new providers in Austria. The Atelier of Vienna, Linz and Graz put the French to shame, and for the first time, the Grande Armée had excess stocks of high quality to put in depot. Despite all these efforts, the Grande Armée remained a hodgepodge of styles and colours. Often these variations had a regional flair. French troops in Spain found the local water skins far preferable to their own tin canteens, which gave their water a metallic tinge. Troops on Italian, Balkan, and Iberian fronts also shed as much of their uniform as possible in the summer months, only to quickly redon whatever civilian clothing could be bought or stolen as temps fell. Campaigning in Russia brought with it the opportunity to outfit units with fur caps, a tendency that the Imperial Guard quickly petitioned against as they felt the dignity was theirs by right. Rain and sleet in Germany required greatcoats. French-made stock tended to shrink if submerged for washing, while stocks taken from defeated Prussia disintegrated. Getting a hands on an Austrian coat was like finding gold, as they were of superb quality. In addition to his uniform, a French soldier carried an array of personal equipment needed to sustain him in the field. The list is long. He carried spare cloth for repairing his uniform and linen for bandages, bread, flour and other foods, as well as kitchen utensils like spoons, pots and pans, a spare pair of boots or at least some nails to fix the sole, a giberne with 30 to 60 cartridges, tools for basic weapon maintenance and some spare flints, a bedroll or bundle of hay, and on top of all of this, any booty, extra food, or spare clothing the soldier chose to tuck away. All of this was stuffed into a sack, a bag, made of leather or canvas. Whatever didn't fit in the sack was carried at the hip alongside a canteen filled with water or wine and a long bayonet. You can imagine the Grande Armée making quite the racket as it marched with the sound of thousands of pots and pans, swords and scabbards clanging together. All of this equipment, official or not, weighed nearly 30 kilos. Perhaps it's unsurprising then that many soldiers ditched everything that wasn't essential. Kitchen utensils went first, either sold to locals or dumped at the roadside. The space freed up was filled with whatever the soldier deemed essential, be it food, ammunition, or war trophies taken in battle. On the return trip for the campaign, the ratio tipped in favour of valuables to trade for favours or sell back home. Of course, officers noted general lack of discipline when it came to keeping army equipment. As a campaign dragged on, it fell on the officers to make good the shortfall, sometimes with purchases at their own expense, sometimes by requisition. Some companies, even entire regiments, faced strict punishments for failing to return a full load of equipment. Many weren't even permitted to ditch their kit before battle for fear they'd simply be discarded. Even so, no punishment or entreaty could convince the soldiers to carry shovels or picks for entrenchment work. Following some cursory experiments, the moping proved too great. After all, said the soldiers, that's what the engineers are for. Now that we've thoroughly explored life in the infantry of La Grande Armée, it's time to meet the men who led them, the officer corps. No army can function without solid leadership, and in this regard La Grande Armée was fortunate. Napoleon inherited a highly experienced and competent officer corps. Junior officers, lieutenants on up to captains, were battle-tested veterans. Senior officers, meaning colonels on up to generals, were highly adept tacticians and strategists. The font of this talent was twofold: France's military schools and the crucible of combat. With France engaged near continuously from 1792 to 1802, incompetence was soon spotlighted. Reform and professionalisation cleared the chaff, resulting in, by 1804, the superb French officer corps that led Napoleon's armies throughout his rule. These officers came from two places, both of which we'll cover in a bit of detail to get an idea of the officer corps' demography. The smallest portion were a continuation of Royal Army officers who supported the revolution and remained in service, managing the tightrope act of keeping their stations and their heads through the churn of revolution. All officer positions, save for a smattering of junior ranks, had been monopolised by the French nobility, specifically the noblesse d'épée, nobles of the sword. Richer noblesse d'épée, from prestigious lineages, dominated the senior ranks, while noblesse d'épée of humbler means filled the junior ranks. Some former nobles who served the Revolution and later Empire include Marie-Victor Letteur-Morbord, Jean-Joseph d'Hautpoul, Emmanuel Grouchy, and Louis Amalric, the Comte de Narbonne. Narbonne is almost alone as an example of a high-ranking noble, serving as a colonel of infantry until appointment as Minister of War to Louis XVI. Louis-Nicolas de Vaux, in contrast, hailed from a poor noble family in the Yonne. His was the far more typical story for an ex-noble who continued to serve. He began his military career in a military academy, followed by a posting to the army as a lieutenant. That trajectory ought to sound doubly familiar, as it's exactly the same as Napoleon's own early life and education. The overwhelming majority of the officers of the Royal Army were royalists, specifically absolutists, who supported King Louis XVI to the hilt. The rest, including Narbonne, were constitutional monarchists who supported the monarchy but not the king per se, and whose liberal leanings led them to support the revolution and the abolition of nobility. After the king's flight to Varennes and the revolutionary chips were down, the old officer corps was obliterated. Absolutists fled or were purged, leading the constitutional monarchists to assume their vacated positions. Then, as the monarchy was abolished in favour of the republic, the constitutional monarchists yielded to republicans like Napoleon. Thus, within a few short years, from 1789 to 1792, the French officer corps had churned through two generations, leading it to be dominated by the younger up-and-comers who had benefited from education in the military theories and principles of the old order, but would never have made it far within that system owing to a lack of social standing. The list of these officers reads like an honour roll of some of France's most effective soldiers and leaders. Antoine de Salles, Amédée Larpe, Jean-Baptiste Kléber, Louis Dessay, Henri Clark, Louis-Alexandre Berthier, Jean-Marie Savary, Jean Régnier, Antoine Delmas, Vincent Saint-Hilaire, and of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. The same space which had opened to allow academy-trained officers to gain rapid advancement also made space for motivated patriotic volunteers to carve their own place. In the main, the volunteer officers who served in the campaigns of 1792 and 1793 are portrayed as highly motivated but totally in over their heads. This description, as is often the case, fails to explain the complexity of the situation. Volunteer officers often had some military experience and were elevated by a claim to lead a unit. In that situation, they didn't need to know how to form complex formations or handle administration if all they were there to do was raise recruits and lead them into action. Technical incompetence in the minutiae of warfare could be cushioned by the trained cadres of NCOs and junior officers. As the Revolutionary Army was professionalised under the stewardship of Lazare-Carnot and later Napoleon, it was this cadre of NCOs and junior officers who overtook the volunteer officers. We have another honour roll on our hands. Veteran soldiers like Nicolas Oudinot, who made general from sergeant. Jean Lannes, a volunteer with no formal training, who proved to be one of his generation's brightest talents. Joachim Murat, who enlisted in the cavalry as a private and would end up as the Empire's foremost cavalryman. Barthélemy Joubert, a volunteer corporal in 1791, Général de Division by 1796. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, another private turned general. And even though we're beyond gratuitous, I'll add the names Claude Victor Perrin, Gouvion Saint-Cyr, Charles Leclerc, Victor Moreau, Pierre Augereau, Henri de Laborde, Michel Ney, Andos Junot, and Jean-Pierre Marchand. This list of officers, though impressive, belies a problem at the heart of the French army. These were the officers who made it, who proved effective combat leaders and capable administrators. Upon assuming the consulship, Napoleon found his officer corps had no lack of brave leaders, but ones whose abilities definitely had a ceiling. Without formal military training, and in many cases, any formal education at all, the officer corps was still only semi-professional. There were lieutenants who couldn't handle inspections, generals with no grasp of strategy, and illiterate captains who couldn't read nor write a report. All of this put greater strain on the trained officers who had come up through one of France's military schools or academies. This was especially problematic in specialist fields like in the medical service, engineers, and artillery. I'll stress that these officers were not incompetent, they'd won every war they'd fought, but they were not the kind of professionals needed to staff a permanent force. So as part of Napoleon's early military reforms, he pensioned off a chunk of the junior and senior officer corps and limited the number of generals to only 360. The vacancies were filled up by promotions from within, all of whom came from the cadre of trained or experienced officers whose names we've covered. But this solution created its own problem: thousands of spaces to be filled in the now denuded junior officer ranks. As first consul, Napoleon's heavy investment in France's civil and military education system both repaired the damage done during the Revolution and continued educational projects put on ice during the first few wars of the coalition. A fresh crop of talent had already reached maturity by the time Grande Armée was formed. A typical cadet would begin at a lycée for basic literacy and numeracy, then graduate to a collège for military education, until finally ending up at an école from where they would graduate as officers. This pathway built upon the primary, secondary, and tertiary distinction established in Revolutionary-era schools, though the ages of admission could vary widely, from boys as young as 7 all the way to 18. All over France, abandoned schools were reopened, namely the Prytanée, which started a new term as a collège in 1800. But the main event was the collège at Fontainebleau, established in 1803. Built on the basis of the old Collège de Louis le Grand, the École Militaire Nationale, the National Military School, produced most of the officers who would fill the ranks of Grande Armée's officer corps. Admission was hotly contested. Notable families of military pedigree vied to have their sons enrolled. An annual fee of 1,200 francs would have kept all but the wealthiest aspirants away, were it not for a series of concessions to sons of veterans and recipients of the Légion d'honneur. Special dispensations from Napoleon, as happened in the aftermath of Austerlitz, waived the fee entirely for orphans or those soldiers whose sons wished to share their father's career. In all cases, a cadet was subjected to a stringent examination. They had to be numerate and literate, fit and healthy, and deemed well-mannered. If they passed these tests and interviews, they were inculcated into a martial culture of strict discipline and intensive study. There was to be no dueling, no popular literature, and most odiously of all, no tobacco. Early on, Napoleon inspected these schools personally and kept apprised of their conditions. He was insistent that a graduate leave the school with a broad base of knowledge. There could be nothing in the military sphere which they could not perform at least decently. This included much of what Napoleon had learnt: marksmanship, mathematics, languages, history, swordsmanship, and fieldworks. There were even dedicated classes for things like intonation, quite literally, how to yell properly. Mercifully, classes on dancing, cosmetics, and etiquette didn't have a place in a post-revolutionary officer corps and were dropped from the curriculum. Throughout the Napoleonic era, existing schools would be expanded and new ones opened. After a lackluster inspection by Napoleon in 1803, the Prytanée main campus in Saint-Cyr in Paris was turned into its own school. The Prytanée then relocated to La Flèche in the Sarthe, where it specialized in training officers from French allies and client states. Eventually, the École Militaire was moved from Fontainebleau to Saint-Cyr in 1808, massively expanding its size and scope. By this time, it had become a de facto infantry school. Prospective cavalry officers graduated from the École Spéciale de Cavalerie de Saint-Germain, founded in 1809. The main artillery and engineering school was the famous École Polytechnique, founded in 1794 and militarized in 1804. The Polytechnique was in friendly competition with the École d'application de l'artillerie and the École d'application du génie, the applied artillery and engineering schools respectively, both located in Metz. Graduates from all of these institutions eventually earned their épaulettes and joined their branch of service. Older officers were almost immediately unimpressed with the fresh-faced graduates. They were hot-headed, prone to aggression, and constantly looking for a fight. In times of peace or in the rear lines, this meant dueling and playing pranks. Elisée Blaze, who graduated the École Militaire as a sous-lieutenant in 1806, recounts in his memoirs one story where he was placed under house arrest for commandeering a mayor's coach. In revenge, his mates disassembled the coach under cover of night and rebuilt it on the mayor's roof. Escapades like this were common, in addition to the daily vices of smoking, gambling and whoring, enjoyed to the full now that the young officers weren't under the overawing gaze of their headmasters and prefects. The problem here seems to have been a clash of cultures in the esprit du corps of the new generation versus the previous generation. The new officers had been weaned on stories of French martial excellence, regaled by their brothers, fathers and educators. They'd never known France to be anything less than victorious. This inculcated a strong spirit of aggression and bravado that clashed with the quiet professionalism of established senior officers, who had lived through the trial and tribulation of some of France's bleakest hours. Culture clash aside, the newest generation were competent, as was proved when La Grande Armée was unleashed on Europe in 1805. Gradually, the generational divide faded, and the officer corps founded a cohesive identity under fire, exactly in the same way the volunteers and veterans of the Revolution had. New generations of officers churned out from 1809 onwards struggled to find a place within the officer corps. Their educational standards declined as the wars of the coalition progressed, due to the constant need to replace officer casualties and find ones to embed in foreign regiments. The initial 2-year course to be made sous-lieutenant, which included at least a few months' practical instruction, was abbreviated to just a year. Replacements year on year were simply not up to the same caliber as those of the previous. Illiteracy, delinquency, and incompetence became critical issues. Irreplaceable officer losses in Eastern Europe, and then the crisis year of 1813, saw the education system all but collapse. Cadets were given a few weeks' instruction and then sent to the front. Reserve officers in the National Guard, with precious little experience, led frontline units. Even when bolstered by retired or invalided officers hastily returned to service, the damage was mortal. The backbone of cohesion within the officer corps was its promotion system. Established officers placed a premium on seniority. Ambitious, usually junior officers, had little regard for the existing hierarchy, asserting that their ability and actions counted for far more than years served. Napoleon was aware of the opposite pull between seniority and meritocracy and endeavoured to balance the two. He laid out a series of regulations on promotions, essentially formalising the de facto system already in place. Officer promotions could be made from within the ranks of the senior NCOs, namely the sergeants. Company sergeants would select candidates from among themselves for a vacancy. The candidate had to have served a minimum of 4 years as an NCO and at least 2 prior years as an enlisted soldier. If all was in order, the company's sous-lieutenant would then have their pick, accepting or denying the candidate. Further promotions up the officer ranks followed a similar set of rules. Where possible, all promotions were within the same regiment and within the same branch of service. This was obviously to avoid the issue of putting, say, a cavalryman in charge of the cannons, but also to maintain continuity. Officer vacancies could be filled by any officer of the rank below who had served in that position for at least 2 years. Here, straight seniority reigned, as the colonel made the call. In some cases, however, especially when on campaign, Napoleon endorsed promotion by acclamation. The officers would gather, choose a suitable candidate, and then have the colonel justify his refusal or acceptance on their recommendation out in the open. In all cases, a successful promotion passed one final check: a vetting from the Ministry of War. In this way, Napoleon had final say on all officer promotions. That said, he was careful about when and where he placed a thumb on the scale, knowing well that any undue promotions would rankle the army. In the main, he promoted officers or enlisted men whom he had personally led. Such elevations were extremely popular, the emperor descending on the troops to give a field commission and well-earned promotion. The next type of promotion was that recommended to him by his senior officers. It wasn't possible to see all of the acts of bravery deserving of promotion, and so Napoleon generally greenlit most that had crossed his desk. The third type were those venal promotions, motivated by dynastic and political concerns. In these cases, Napoleon would ignore seniority and competence altogether, and simply elevate a candidate by decree. Odious though they were, it was understood that such promotions were extraordinary. The officers in question were kept from doing any real damage either with coddling staff or postings to ceremonial and non-combat roles. The primary source from which most of this information comes, John Elting's Swords Around a Throne, includes a helpful table of comparative ranks between the Grande Armée and contemporary armies. Officer ranks began at sous-lieutenant, as we've covered, being equivalent to a second lieutenant. Lieutenant equals a first lieutenant. Capitaine is a captain. Chef de bataillon, a major. The Grande Armée's major equates to a lieutenant colonel. And then colonel is the same in both rankings. A général de brigade is a brigadier general. A général de division, a major general. It's worth noting that in the French system there were a few duplicate positions. So, for instance, a major en second or colonel en second have no modern equivalents, but are best understood as co- or vice positions in context. Were things so easy for staff ranks? You've already seen most of the permanent and temporary staff rankings, and now look at companies through to regiments. Adjoint, adjutant, and major were prefixes attached to various officer ranks, which denoted specific functions within the staff. Adjoint meant junior, and applied to captain and lieutenant ranks. Adjutant denoted seniority, but in context something closer to co- or deputy, as they were seconded to a major position at general's rank. It's all very confusing, so don't worry about it, especially since we've covered it already. It's enough to know that staff officer ranks preceded regular officer ranks. There are a few of the ranks worth mentioning which have no modern equivalent. A colonel général served in all cases as a senior inspector in all branches. Non-martial corps commanders had no official rank, no commandant de corps. They were either a général de division, simply an overall corps command, or a lieutenant général in charge of a corps-sized reserve. A commandant was a garrison commander in charge of a fortification. Given a town or city was a military governor, a gouverneur. And finally we have the most famous of all French ranks, marshal, marshal of the empire. Given the importance of the marshalate, extending well beyond just its military matters, it'll get its own treatment in a separate episode. The quality of life as an officer depended on two things: seniority and personal wealth. An officer of any rank who had some independent wealth could live comfortably off campaign. Officers of meagre means might be more dependent on their wages or regimental allowances to live with the dignity befitting an officer. A major expense was the uniform, always more elaborate than those of the enlisted ranks. All infantry officers required distinctive coats topped with their badge of office, golden epaulettes. Around their necks hung a gorget of polished metal, and at the side a sabre briquet or an épée. Depending on the unit, an officer's shako, bearskin or bicorn had to be worn too. The initial expense of buying all this kit was excessive. A promotion from the ranks brought with it a gratuity, usually enough to cover the basics of the uniform, but in all other cases an officer had to pay their own way. For most, this was tough. An officer might be a gentleman, but he was rarely flush. Pay was meagre, and food, clothing and accommodation took the lion's share. Daily duties would invariably keep a diligent officer occupied, and so he relied upon a servant. The poorest officers pooled their money to pay for a shared domestic, while the richest had a small household of half a dozen liveried dogs' bodies. An officer of typical means, usually at a senior rank, could afford a personal servant in a basic uniform. The life of a servant was dull, but cooking, cleaning and porting were only their official duties. By hook or by crook, servants did whatever they needed to serve their officers, up to stealing, extortion and assault. Come the occasion, he might also serve as a second in duels. Naturally, then there were some murky stories surrounding servants. Many were conditionally loyal and skeeved off with their master's property at the first hint of trouble. Others defected or hid when the going got tough. The best servants were invariably those who were both practical and loyal, and they tended to come from prisoners of war. The French favoured multilingual Poles, Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs and Slovaks who could act as interpreter. French, Dutch and especially Italian conscripts proved good too, as they would gladly become a servant to avoid fighting. The exceptions were regular soldiers seconded to an officer. This was a punishment in all but name, as fetching an officer's firewood was not anyone's idea of a good time. Like the enlisted men, the officers had the same vices, born as always of boredom in long periods of nothingness. Smoking, drinking, gambling and whoring were common among the junior ranks. Senior officers differed in that they partook of higher brow distractions like card games, hunting and soirees. Indebtedness was the norm, as most officers hovered in and out of solvency. A good officer might find his regiment protecting him from creditors, but when those creditors were his fellow officers, things got tricky. Trickier still they became when infidelity was thrown into the mix. Indeed, the French were famous not merely for their military conquests. A game was played to sleep with a girl in every nation an officer visited. Cavalry officers were particularly incorrigible in this regard, but the infantry and artillery officers had their share of hijinks too. At a certain point, infidelity did far less harm to one's own standing amongst their peers than cuckoldry or indebtedness. Naturally, these flings were a source of friction, one among many. Dueling was outlawed by Napoleon, but that only meant it was conducted in secret. The French preferred sword duels, though a bayonet would do in a pinch. Deaths were common despite Napoleon's ruling, and it was an issue he never effectively clamped down on. Such distractions died down on campaign. Basics like food, clothing and equipment were the major concerns outside of combat. A good officer's funds were stretched as they purchased, as a precaution, anything they felt their men might need, including the considerable expense of extra wagons or horses. Difficulties aside, officers of Grande Armée were good at what they did, remaining effective and cohesive all throughout the wars of the coalition. What bound them was a strong sense of personal loyalty to Napoleon, to whom they were required to swear an oath. Nationalism and a belief in the superiority of French arms were near universal too. Undoubtedly, though, the true connective tissue for the officers was their irrepressible esprit du corps, a shared professionalism and camaraderie born of mutual hardships under arms. Despite some high-profile refusals, thousands of officers defected to Napoleon's side during the 100 Days campaign. And even long after his death, Bonapartism was endemic to former imperial officers, remaining a potent force in French politics for the rest of the 19th century. That's all for the infantry and the infantry officer corps. Next up, we charge headlong into a survey of the French cavalry arm, replete with dashing hussars, imperious cuirassiers, and trusty dragoons. We'll also peer behind the curtain to see what life was like for France's brave cavalry commanders who earned enduring fame in the saddle.